Ray Harmon had been flying over the plains of Nebraska for nearly 25 years, his weathered crop duster a familiar sight against the vast Midwestern sky. To the local farmers, he was just Ray, reliable, straightforward, mind his own business. Ray. But that all changed the moment he decided to land his plane during that summer storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun glinted off the wings of Ray's old Agcat biplane as he guided it over the endless rows of corn, the familiar rhythm of the engine like a heartbeat beneath him. At 53, Ray had spent more time in the air than many commercial pilots, though his runways were dirt strips and his passengers were usually bags of fertilizer. There was something almost meditative about flying the dusty fields of Cedar County, watching the geometric patterns of farmland unfold beneath him like a patchwork quilt. Up here, everything made sense, just Ray, his plane, and the endless sky. The worries that plagued him on the ground seemed to dissolve at 3,000 feet. After returning from the service, Ray had taken over his father's struggling crop-dusting business. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him connected to the sky he loved. He'd expanded slowly over the years, building a reputation for reliability that had farmers calling from 3 counties over. His small airstrip sat behind the weathered farmhouse he'd inherited, a modest 2-story structure that he'd shared with his wife Sarah until cancer took her 3 years ago. Now it was just him and his German shepherd, Cooper, and the vast emptiness of the Nebraska plains that somehow felt more like home than anywhere else. That Tuesday morning had started like any other. Coffee at dawn, checking weather reports, and a quick inspection of the Agcat before takeoff. He had contracts to spray 5 farms today, standard pest control for cornfields threatened by an early surge of rootworms. By noon, Ray had finished spraying the Henderson property, the chemicals releasing in a fine mist that would protect the crops. The familiar scent of aviation fuel and fertilizer clung to his clothes as he banked the plane westward toward the Johnson farm, his next client waiting with payment and probably a glass of Martha Johnson's famous lemonade. As he skimmed over a stretch of highway separating the properties, Ray spotted dark clouds gathering on the southwestern horizon. The weather report had mentioned a possibility of isolated thunderstorms, but nothing severe enough to cancel today's runs. Still, Ray had learned long ago that the sky had its own plans, regardless of what the meteorologists in Omaha predicted. "Better wrap this up," he muttered to himself, adjusting his course to finish the Johnson field before the weather moved in. He'd seen how quickly summer storms could develop in this part of the country, towering thunderheads building from nothing to wall clouds in under an hour. Through his headset came the crackle of his radio. "Ray, you reading me?" It was Bill Johnson's voice, tinged with concern. "Got a nasty cell heading our way. Might want to hold off on our fields today." Ray keyed his mic. "Already noticed. Think I can beat it if I start now." There was a pause before Bill responded. "Your call, but those clouds look mean. Weather Service just upgraded to severe thunderstorm warning for the county." Ray checked his fuel gauge. He had enough to spray the Johnson place and still make it back to his airstrip with reserve. 25 years of flying, these planes had taught him to read the sky like a book. This storm was moving fast, but he could outrun it. "I'll make a quick pass," Ray decided. "Get at least the south section done before it hits." What most folks in Cedar County didn't know, what Ray himself rarely thought about anymore, was that before he became a simple crop duster, he had flown much faster planes in much more dangerous skies. 20 years in the Air Force had taught him skills few civilian pilots ever needed to use. He'd flown through monsoons in Southeast Asia and sandstorms in the Middle East. A Nebraska thunderstorm didn't worry him much. As he guided the Agcat over the Johnson cornfields, releasing precise lines of pesticide 50 feet above the crops, Ray kept one eye on the approaching storm front. The wall of dark clouds had grown more imposing, lightning now visible in the distant murk. The wind was picking up too, creating turbulence that bounced the small plane like a toy boat on choppy water. After finishing the southern section, Ray made the call. "Bill, that's all I can do today. Storms. Moving faster than I thought. I'll come back tomorrow for the rest." "Roger that. Get home safe, Ray." Banking the plane eastward, Ray pushed the throttle forward, the engine responding with a deeper growl as he gained altitude. He needed to get back to his airstrip before the storm's leading edge reached him. His farm was only 15 minutes away, in good weather, but the headwind was already slowing his progress. The first fat raindrops hit his windshield as he crossed over Route 12, the two-lane highway that connected the small towns dotting eastern Nebraska. The visibility was deteriorating rapidly. Sheets of rain now obscuring the horizon. Ray descended slightly, using the highway as a visual reference point. That's when he saw it. A car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the intensifying downpour. A figure stood beside it, arms waving frantically overhead. Ray's first instinct was to continue home. Stopping now, with the storm bearing down, would be risky, but something made him circle back for a second look. The highway stretched empty in both directions, no other vehicles in sight for miles. He made a quick mental calculation. There was a fallow field about a quarter-mile ahead, relatively. Flat and long enough for the Agcat to land. It would be rough but doable. Ray had made peace with his quiet, predictable life as a crop duster. The adrenaline-fueled days of his military career were long behind him, or so he thought, until the moment he decided to turn his plane around and land in the middle of a gathering storm to help a stranger. That split-second decision would shatter the quiet life he'd built and thrust him into a situation more dangerous than any storm. Decision to land wasn't one Ray made lightly. 25 years of flying had taught him to respect the sky's temperament, especially when dark clouds gathered and wind shears threatened. But something about the lone figure on that empty highway, the desperate waving, the isolation amid the growing storm, triggered instincts he couldn't ignore. Ray banked the Agcat in a tight circle, surveying the fallow field ahead. It wasn't ideal. No landing strip ever was when it wasn't meant to be one, but the ground looked level enough, free of large rocks or irrigation equipment. The real concern was the mud. The early rain had already softened the soil, and his landing gear wasn't designed for off-road conditions. He made another pass, lower this time, feeling the plane shudder as gusts of wind buffeted its wings. The storm was intensifying by the minute, the distant rumble of thunder now a constant backdrop to the engine's drone. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Ray could see the stranded motorist more clearly. A woman in a light-colored jacket, her hair whipping wildly in the wind. She had stepped back from the road, watching his plane with evident disbelief. "All right, old girl," Ray muttered to his aircraft. "Let's make this count." He lined up with the longest stretch of the field, cut his airspeed, and began his descent. The crosswind made the approach tricky, pushing the lightweight plane sideways. Ray compensated automatically, muscle memory from thousands of landings guiding his hands. The first drops of rain had become a steady downpour, reducing visibility to mere hundreds of feet. The touchdown was harder than he would have liked. The wheels, hitting uneven ground with a jarring impact that rattled the cockpit. The Agcat bounced once, twice. Before the tires found purchase in the softening soil, Ray fought to keep the plane straight as it rolled to a stop, mud now spraying from beneath the wheels. When the aircraft finally came to rest, about 200 yards from the highway, Ray sat for a moment, his heart pounding. The engine ticked as it cooled, a counterpoint to the drumming of rain on metal and the distant rumble of thunder. He hadn't attempted a landing like that since his early days in the service, when emergency drills were part of the training regimen. Releasing his harness, Ray pulled on his weathered canvas jacket and baseball cap, then pushed open the cockpit door. The rush of wind and rain hit him immediately, soaking his clothes within seconds. He jumped down, his boots sinking ankle-deep into mud. "Great," he muttered. But there was no time to worry about that now. The stranded motorist had already begun, making her way across the field toward him, picking a careful path through the uneven ground. As she approached, Ray was struck by how young she appeared. Mid-30s maybe, with dark hair now plastered against her face from the rain. Her clothes suggested business rather than local. The light jacket was more suited to office buildings than rural Nebraska, and her shoes were definitely not made for muddy fields. "Are you okay?" Ray called over the howl of the wind, meeting her halfway. She stared at him, then at the plane behind, her expression a mixture of relief and astonishment. Did you land just for me?" Ray nodded, water streaming from the brim of his cap. "Saw you from up there. Figured you might need some help." "Car trouble?" The woman glanced back toward the highway where her sedan sat abandoned, then returned her gaze to Ray. "Engine just died. Won't start again. I tried calling for help, but there's no cell service out here." Ray wasn't surprised. This stretch of Route 12 was notorious for dead zones, one of the many inconveniences of rural life that locals had learned to work around. "Where you headed?" "Maplewood," she said, naming a town about 30 miles east. Ray squinted through the rain at the darkening sky. "Well, you're not getting there tonight. Not in this weather, and definitely not in that car." He gestured toward the Agcat. "I've got a farm about 10 miles back. You can wait out the storm there, figure things out once it passes." The woman hesitated, studying him with an intensity that made Ray slightly uncomfortable. It was the look of someone weighing risks, making calculations. Finally she nodded. "Thank you, I'm Elise Morgan." "Ray Harmon," he replied, extending a weathered hand which she briefly shook. Her grip was firmer than he expected, her hand surprisingly calloused for someone in business attire. "We should grab anything you need from your car," Ray said, already, turning toward the highway. "This storm's just getting started." They trudged across the field together, the mud making each step a labor. By the time they reached her sedan, a late-model Audi with rental car plates, the rain had become a torrential downpour that limited visibility to mere yards. Lightning flashed overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Elise quickly retrieved a sleek laptop bag and a small overnight case from the trunk. Ray noticed she locked the car with a key fob, a meaningless gesture on this deserted stretch of road, but something about the way she clutched the laptop bag, keeping it close to her body, protected from the rain beneath her jacket, caught his attention. Back at the plane, Ray helped her climb into the passenger seat, a tight fit in the cockpit designed primarily for a single pilot. "Ever flown in one of these before?" he asked as he settled into his seat. She shook her head, water droplets flying from her hair. "First time for everything." Ray smiled briefly as he began the pre-flight check. "Not exactly first-class accommodations, but she'll get us where we need to go." The takeoff would be challenging in these conditions. The field was already turning into a muddy quagmire, and the wind had picked up significantly. But staying put wasn't an option either. The storm was intensifying, and the Agcat wasn't designed to weather such conditions on open ground. As Ray fired up the engine, he glanced at his passenger. Elise sat rigidly in her seat, eyes fixed forward, still clutching that laptop bag. There was something about her demeanor that didn't quite fit. A tension, a vigilance that seemed out of place for someone simply caught in a storm with car trouble. But Ray had learned long ago not to pry into other people's business. Whatever her story, it wasn't his concern. His job was simply to get them safely back to his farm, where she could make arrangements once the weather cleared. The Agcat's engine roared to life, the propeller cutting through sheets of rain. Ray taxied to the end of the field, giving himself as much runway as possible for takeoff. The wheels struggled for traction in the increasingly muddy ground. "Might be a bit rough," he warned, raising his voice over the engine noise. "Hold on tight." Elise nodded, knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. Ray pushed the throttle forward, and the plane surged ahead, bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. The airspeed indicator crept upward, agonizingly slowly. They needed more speed, but the mud was fighting them every inch of the way. Just when Ray thought they might not make it, a gust of wind caught the wings, providing the extra lift they needed. The Agcat broke free from the sucking mud, struggling into the air with a groan of metal and machinery. They were airborne, but far from safe. The storm had fully engulfed them now, turning day into a premature, menacing dusk. Rain lashed at them, windshield, and the small aircraft bucked and dipped with each gust of wind. Ray kept his focus on the instruments, his hands steady on the controls, despite the chaos surrounding them. This was the kind of flying that demanded every ounce of skill and experience he possessed. Beside him, Elise remained silent, but Ray could feel her eyes on him, watching his every move, studying his reactions. Not panicked, he noted with interest. Most first-time passengers would be white-knuckled and terrified in these conditions, but Elise seemed evaluative, almost professional in her assessment. "You've got some experience with planes," Ray observed, not taking his eyes off the controls. There was the briefest pause before she answered. "What makes you say that?" "You're too calm. Most people would be falling apart in weather like this." Another pause. "I've flown in bad conditions before." Ray nodded but didn't press further. The farm was coming into view now, a collection of buildings nestled among fields of corn and wheat. His landing strip, little more than a flattened dirt path with wind markers, waited behind the main house. As they descended toward the farm, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that his simple act of kindness had just complicated his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Landing in these conditions would require his complete concentration. What Ray couldn't know, was that by this time tomorrow, his quiet existence would be shattered by the arrival of military aircraft in his airspace. And the woman sitting beside him was the reason why. The landing was rougher than Ray would have liked, the Agcat bouncing twice on the dirt airstrip before settling into a bumpy roll. Rain hammered against the metal fuselage, driven horizontally by gusts of wind that threatened to push the lightweight aircraft sideways. Ray kept both hands firm on the controls until they had slowed to a safe taxi speed, only then allowing himself to exhale the breath he'd been holding. "Home, sweet home," he said, guiding the plane toward the small hangar at the end of the strip. The structure was little more than a glorified shed, but it would shield the aircraft from the worst of the storm. Elise had remained silent throughout the landing, her eyes fixed on the rain-blurred landscape outside. At Ray's words, she turned to him with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you. That was impressive flying." There was something knowing in her assessment, as if she had experience by which to judge. Ray filed that observation away with the growing collection of small details that didn't add up about his mysterious passenger. He taxied the plane into the hangar, the engine's roar echoing off the metal walls as he maneuvered into position. When he finally cut power, the sudden absence of noise was jarring, leaving only the drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. "We'll make a run for the house," Ray said, reaching behind his seat for a large umbrella. "It's only about 50 yards, but in this weather, that's enough to get soaked through." Elise nodded, gathering her laptop bag and overnight case close to her chest. She seemed more concerned about keeping these items dry than herself, Ray noticed. They dashed from the hangar to the farmhouse, rain pelting them despite the umbrella's protection. The wind had grown fierce enough to bend the tops of the surrounding trees, their branches thrashing against the darkening sky. By the time they reached the covered porch, both were breathing hard, clothes damp despite their brief exposure. A deep, booming bark greeted them from inside the house, followed by the scrabble of claws against hardwood. Ray smiled for the first time since spotting Elise on the highway. "That's Cooper. Don't worry, he sounds fiercer than he is." Ray unlocked the door and was immediately met by 90 pounds of enthusiastic German shepherd, front paws landing briefly on his chest before the dog turned his attention to the stranger. Cooper circled Elise warily, sniffing at her legs and the bag she carried. "Cooper, down!" Ray commanded, and the dog obediently backed off, though his eyes remained fixed on Elise. "He's not used to visitors. None of us are, to be honest." The interior of the farmhouse was modest but well-maintained. The front door opened directly into a living room, furnished with worn but comfortable-looking furniture. A leather recliner positioned to face an older model television, a plaid sofa that had seen better days, and a coffee table stacked with farming magazines and equipment catalogues. Beyond that was a country kitchen with wooden countertops and appliances that were functional rather than fashionable. A dining table with 4 chairs sat beneath a window that looked out over fields now, obscured by sheets of rain. "It's not much," Ray said, suddenly aware of how Spartan his home must appear to an outsider. "But it's dry and warm. It's dry." Beside him, Elise remained silent, but Ray could feel her eyes on him, watching his every move, studying his reactions. Not panicked, he noted with interest. Most first-time passengers would be white-knuckled and terrified in these conditions, but Elise seemed evaluative, almost professional in her assessment. "You've got some experience with planes," Ray observed, not taking his eyes off the controls. "It's perfect," Elise replied, though her eyes darted around the space as if cataloguing exits and potential threats, another behavior that struck Ray as unusual for someone who had simply been stranded by car trouble. He gestured toward the sofa. "Make yourself comfortable. I'll get some towels and see about some coffee." Ray moved down the hallway to the linen closet, pulling out 2 clean towels. As he did, he caught a glimpse of himself in the bathroom mirror, hair plastered to his forehead, lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than he remembered, the beginnings of grey at his temples. When had he gotten so old? Returning to the living room, he found Elise standing by the window, phone in hand, frowning at the screen. "No service," she said without looking up. "I was hoping to let my colleagues know I'm delayed." "Landline's in." "The kitchen," Ray offered, tossing her one of the towels. "Though the storm might have taken down the lines already, it happens out here more often than not." Elise caught the towel deftly, another small detail that registered in Ray's mind. Her reflexes were quick, her movements precise. She dried her face and hair, then followed Ray into the kitchen. "You said you were headed to Maplewood," Ray asked as he filled the coffee maker. "Business trip?" Elise hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. "Yes, I'm in agricultural technology sales. Had a meeting scheduled with some local farmers." Ray nodded, though he didn't entirely believe her. He'd spent enough time around both farmers and salespeople to know that Elise fit neither category particularly well. Her hands, while surprisingly calloused, lacked the deep-set dirt and permanent tan lines of someone who worked the land, and she had none of the forced cheerfulness or practiced small talk of a career salesperson. "Coffee'll be ready in a few minutes," he said, deciding not to press further. "Kitchen phone's all yours if you want to try it." While Elise dialed, Ray rummaged through the refrigerator for something to offer his unexpected guest. Sarah had always been the hospitable one, knowing exactly what to serve visitors and how to make them feel welcome. Since her passing, Ray rarely entertained, and his culinary skills were limited at best. He settled on some cheese, crackers, and apple slices, arranging them haphazardly on a plate. Behind him he could hear Elise's one-sided conversation. "Yes, I'm safe. No unexpected delay. Weather's too bad to continue." There was a long pause. I know the timeline is tight. I'll make it work. No, I'm staying with... Her voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. A local. Crop duster pilot. No, I don't think so, but... Another pause. I'll handle it. Just be ready tomorrow at the arranged location. Ray deliberately made noise with the refrigerator door to signal his return, giving Elise time to finish her conversation. When he turned around, plate in hand, she was just hanging up the phone. Got through? He asked casually. Elise nodded. Yes, thankfully. Let my team know I'm safe, but delayed. She eyed the plate he carried. You didn't have to go to any trouble. It's no trouble. Not exactly a gourmet spread, but it'll tide us over until dinner. They settled at the kitchen table with the modest snack between them. Outside, the storm continued unabated, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the corners of the house. Cooper had positioned himself at Elise's feet, his initial wariness apparently overcome. Some view you must have when the weather's clear, Elise commented, gesturing toward the window. Ray nodded. Farmland as far as you can see. Some people find it boring, but I've always loved it. The symmetry of the fields, the changing colors with the seasons, it's peaceful. And you fly over all this. That must be amazing. It has its moments, Ray agreed, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Though most days it's just work. Spraying chemicals isn't exactly the glamorous side of aviation. But you were military before this, weren't you? Elise asked, her eyes suddenly sharp with interest. Ray's hand stilled momentarily as he set the coffee pot down. What makes you say that? Elise shrugged, the gesture too casual to be genuine. The way you handled the plane in those conditions, the military photos in the hallway, the discipline in how you keep your home. She sipped her coffee. Plus, you've got the look. The look of someone who's seen more than crop fields and small-town life. Her eyes met his directly now. I recognize it because I've seen it before. The statement hung between them, loaded with implication. Ray considered his response carefully, studying the woman across from him. There was more to Elise Morgan than she was letting on. Much more. But pushing too hard might shut down whatever. Fragile trust was building between them. Air Force, he finally acknowledged. 20 years, retired as a major. What did you fly? Again, Ray hesitated. Most civilians asked vague, general questions about military service. Elise's queries were specific, targeted. Started with trainers, moved to transport, finished my career in special operations aviation. Elise nodded, as if this confirmed something for her. Quite a shift to crop dusting. It suited me after Sarah. My wife got sick, needed to be somewhere stable, close to medical facilities. After she passed, Ray trailed off, surprised at himself for sharing something so personal with a stranger. Well, by then this place had become home. A flash of what might have been genuine sympathy crossed Elise's face. I'm sorry about your wife. Been 3 years now, Ray said, looking down into his coffee. You adjust, even when you don't want to. The conversation lulled, filled only by the sounds of the storm and Cooper's occasional sighs from under the table. Ray found himself wondering what series of decisions and circumstances had led to this moment. A retired Air Force pilot and a mysterious woman sharing coffee in his kitchen while a Nebraska thunderstorm raged outside. The landline should work. For calling a tow truck once the weather clears, Ray offered, breaking the silence. Or I can drive you to Maplewood tomorrow if your car can't be fixed quickly. Thank you, Elise said, though her response seemed automatic, her mind elsewhere. She glanced at her watch, then out at the darkening sky. What time do you think the storm will pass? Weather report said it should move through overnight. By morning it should be clear enough to fly, at least. Elise nodded, a decision apparently made. I appreciate the shelter for the night, then. I don't want to impose more than necessary. Ray stood collecting their empty mugs. Guest rooms down the hall, first door on the right, bathrooms across from it. I'll find you some dry clothes. They'll be too big, but they're clean. As he turned toward the sink, Ray caught Elise glancing at her laptop bag again. That same protective look crossing her face. Whatever was in there clearly held significant value to her, either monetary or informational. And in that moment, standing in his humble farm kitchen with rain pounding against the windows and a stranger at his table, Ray felt the first real stirring of unease, a sense that by landing his plane on that muddy field, he had set in motion events that would reach far beyond the borders of his quiet existence. What he couldn't possibly know was how right that instinct would prove to be. Night had settled fully. Over the farm, the storm's intensity undiminished as darkness fell. Ray stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in brief electric flashes. The weather radio on the counter crackled with updates, flash flood warnings for several counties, wind advisories, reports of downed power. Lines. He'd prepared a simple dinner, beef stew from the freezer, Sarah's recipe that he'd learned to make in the lonely months after her passing. Elise had eaten quietly, complimenting the food, but otherwise lost in thought. Now she was in the guest room, the door closed, presumably changing into the clothes Ray had lent her, an old Air Force t-shirt and sweatpants that would dwarf her smaller frame. Cooper padded into the kitchen, pressing his wet nose against Ray's hand. The dog had been unusually attentive to their visitor, following her movements with an intensity that Ray rarely saw, except when strangers approached the property. But it wasn't aggression, more like curiosity, or perhaps concern. "What do you think, boy?" Ray murmured, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "Something off about our guest?" Cooper whined softly in response, his tail giving a single uncertain wag. The landline phone rang, startling both of them. Ray checked his watch. Nearly 9:30 p.m., late for casual calls in farming country where most were in bed by this hour. He crossed to the wall-mounted phone, lifting the receiver. "Harmon residence. Ray, it's Bill Johnson." The connection was poor, static crackling between words. "Just checking you made it home ahead of this monster storm." "Yeah, got in a few hours." "Go," Ray replied, deliberately omitting mention of his detour and passenger. "How's it looking out your way?" "Creek's rising faster than I've seen in years. Jameson's already got water in his basement." "Listen." Bill's voice was briefly lost in a surge of static. "Warned about possible tornadoes. Keep your weather radio on tonight." "Will do. Thanks for the heads up." Heads up. After hanging up, Ray moved through the house, double-checking windows and doors, a routine security measure he'd maintained since his military days. When he reached the guest room, he paused, hearing a muffled voice from inside. Elise was speaking, her tone urgent but hushed. Ray didn't mean to eavesdrop, but years of training had sharpened his senses. Despite the storm's noise, fragments of her conversation carried through the door. Confirmation on the files. "Yes, I'm certain." "No, I don't think I was followed, but..." A pause. "The rental's abandoned on Route 12. I know it's a risk, but I had no choice. Local pilot, former military, Air Force, Special Operations." Ray stepped back, processing what he'd heard. Elise had told him her phone had no service, yet she was clearly speaking to someone. She must have another phone, one with better reception than the basic models most locals carried. And whoever she was talking to seemed very interested in his military background. He moved away before she could detect his presence, returning to the kitchen where Cooper waited. The German shepherd tilted his head questioningly. "Yeah, I'm thinking." "The same thing," Ray muttered. 20 minutes later, Elise emerged wearing Ray's borrowed clothes, the shirt hanging almost to her knees, sleeves rolled up multiple times. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face scrubbed. Clean of makeup, the transformation made her look younger but no less alert. "Feel better?" Ray asked, glancing up from the local newspaper he'd been pretending to read. "Much. Thank you." She settled into a chair across from him, Her laptop bag, which hadn't left her side since her arrival, placed carefully at her feet. Any change? In the forecast, still says it should clear by morning, though they're warning about possible tornadoes now. Elise nodded, fingers drumming lightly on the table, another sign of tension Ray couldn't help but notice. If it does clear, how early could we fly tomorrow? First light, if the conditions are right, around 5:30 this time of year. Ray set down his paper. You seem in a hurry to get to Maplewood. Important meeting, she said, the explanation coming too quickly. Can't afford to miss it. Ray nodded slowly, deciding to test the waters. Must be some meeting. Most sales reps I know would just reschedule if they got caught in a storm like this. A flicker of something, annoyance, wariness, crossed Elise's face before she controlled her expression. It's not just any meeting. Potential contract worth millions. The kind that makes or breaks careers. Agricultural technology, you said. Ray kept his tone casual. What kind of products does your company offer? Elise hesitated, just long enough to suggest she was formulating a response rather than recalling familiar information. Precision farming systems, GPS-guided equipment, soil sensors, that sort of thing. It was a plausible answer, but Ray had been around enough farming technology sales pitches to know she was speaking in generalities, not with the technical specificity a true sales representative would use. Interesting field, he said, deciding to press just a little further. Which company do you represent? Another brief hesitation. Agrotech Solutions? We're relatively new, but growing quickly. Ray had never heard of them, but that wasn't surprising. In itself, new agitech startups appeared constantly, most fading away within a few years. Well, he said, rising from his chair, whatever your meeting is, we'll do our best to get you there on time. He gestured toward the hallway. Bathrooms, stocked with fresh towels if you want to shower. I'll be turning in soon. 5:30 comes early. Of course. Elise stood as well, gathering her laptop bag. And Ray, thank you again. Not everyone would have landed a plane to help a stranger. There was genuine gratitude in her voice, which only made the mystery surrounding her more perplexing. Ray offered a small smile. Get some rest. We'll sort everything out in the morning. After Elise had retreated to the guest room, Ray sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the storm and thinking. The woman under his roof was not who she claimed to be. That much was certain. The question was whether she posed any danger to him, and what exactly she was involved in. His military instincts urged caution, perhaps even contacting local authorities. But something held him back. Elise was clearly in some kind of trouble, but she hadn't threatened him in any way. And Ray had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes people had legitimate reasons for concealing their identities. Around midnight, the storm's ferocity finally began to wane, the thunder now distant rumbles rather than house-shaking booms. Ray, unable to sleep, had settled in his recliner with Cooper at his feet, a book open but unread on his lap. The creak of a floorboard caught his attention. He remained still, controlling his breathing to appear asleep while keeping his senses alert. Through slitted eyes, he saw Elise moving quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen, laptop bag clutched. In one hand, she paused at the entrance to the living room, studying his seemingly sleeping form. Ray maintained the deception, keeping his breathing deep and regular. After a moment, apparently satisfied he was truly asleep, she continued into the kitchen. Ray heard the soft click of her laptop opening, followed by the muted tapping of keys. Cooper's ears perked up, but a gentle hand on the dog's head kept him quiet. Minutes passed, the only sounds the fading storm and the occasional tap of computer keys. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. Ray rose silently, years of special operations training allowing him to move without a sound. He approached the kitchen entryway, positioning himself to glimpse Elise without being seen. She sat at the kitchen table, back to him, laptop screen casting a blue glow over her concentrated face. From his angle, Ray couldn't see the screen's contents, but he could see Elise's expression, intense, focused, and unmistakably worried. She inserted a small device, a thumb drive, Ray guessed, into the laptop's port, her movements precise and practiced. Ray retreated to his recliner before she could detect his presence. Whatever Elise was involved in, it clearly went beyond agricultural technology sales. The urgent late-night communication, the secretive handling of data, the inconsistencies in her story, all pointed to something more complex and potentially more dangerous. As he settled back into the chair, Ray made a decision. In the morning he would fly Elise to Maplewood as promised. But he would be much more vigilant, and perhaps make a few inquiries of his own once she was gone. 20 years in the Air Force had left him with contacts who might be able to shed light on what exactly Agrotech Solutions was, and whether Elise Morgan was who she claimed to be. What Ray couldn't possibly anticipate was that he wouldn't need to make those inquiries. By mid-morning tomorrow, the answers would come looking for him, in the form of an F-16 fighter jet intercepting his crop duster over the plains of Nebraska. The storm finally passed around 3 a.m., leaving behind a landscape drenched but intact. Ray had dozed fitfully in his recliner, waking at every unfamiliar sound. At some point, Elise had returned to the guest room, taking her laptop with her. Now, as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Ray moved quietly through his morning routine, coffee brewing, a quick check of weather conditions, a brief inspection of the property for storm damage. Cooper followed at his heels, the dog unusually alert for the early hour. The farmhouse had weathered the storm well, with only a few small branches down in the yard. The airstrip, visible from the kitchen window, showed puddles reflecting the growing light, but nothing that would prevent takeoff. The AgCat, safely housed in the hangar, would be ready to fly as soon as Ray completed his pre-flight checks. As he poured his first cup of coffee, Ray heard movement from the guest room. Moments later, Elise appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in yesterday's now dry business clothes, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She looked as if she had slept as little as Ray had. "Morning," Ray greeted her, holding up the coffee pot. "Cup before we head out?" "Please," she accepted. The mug he offered, wrapping both hands around it, as if seeking warmth despite the mild morning temperature. "Storms past?" Ray nodded. "Clear skies for now. We should be able to take off within the hour." Relief visibly washed over Elise's features. "Perfect. I appreciate the urgency." They drank their coffee in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, each studying the other with veiled interest. Ray had decided not to confront Elise about the inconsistencies in her story. At least not yet. Better to get her to her destination and then determine what, if anything, he needed to do about his suspicions. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the damp fields in golden light, Ray headed to the hangar to prepare the AgCat. "Of light," Elise followed, her overnight bag in one hand, laptop case clutched firmly in the other. Cooper trotted alongside them, still unwilling to let their visitor out of his sight. The morning was quiet in that special way that follows a major storm, birds tentatively resuming their songs, the drip of water from saturated leaves, the occasional distant rumble of farm equipment as Ray's neighbors began assessing damage and resuming work. It was the kind of peaceful Nebraska morning that had drawn Ray back after his military service, the simplicity and beauty of it a balm for the chaos he had witnessed overseas. Yet today, that peace felt tenuous, threatened by the mysteries surrounding the woman walking beside him. What Ray didn't know was that the calm wouldn't last much longer. The wheels had already been set in motion by Elise's presence on his farm, and soon the quiet Nebraska sky would be shattered by the roar of military jets. bringing with them questions, dangers, and decisions that would challenge everything. Ray thought he knew about his peaceful retirement. The morning sun glinted off the Agcat's wings as Ray completed his pre-flight inspection. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking control surfaces, examining the engine, inspecting every inch of the aircraft for storm damage. 25 years of flying had ingrained these routines so deeply he could perform them half asleep, which was fortunate given his restless night. Elise stood a short distance away, her attention divided between watching Ray's preparations and scanning the surrounding landscape. Her posture remained alert, almost vigilant, as if expecting trouble to materialize from the rain-soaked cornfields. The laptop bag hung from her shoulder, never more than an arm's length from her grasp. "She looks good," Ray announced, patting the plane's fuselage. "No damage from yesterday's landing. We should be in Maplewood in about 30 minutes, weather permitting." Elise nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Perfect. The sooner we get there, the better." As they prepared to board, Cooper began barking, sharp, insistent sounds that made both humans turn toward the farmhouse. A vehicle was approaching, dust rising behind it as it sped down the long driveway connecting Ray's property to the main road. "Expecting someone?" Elise asked, tension immediately returning to her voice. Ray shook his head, squinting against the morning sun to identify the vehicle. "That's Sheriff Miller's truck. Haven't seen him out this way in months." The transformation in Elise was immediate and alarming. Her face drained of color, her body language shifting from alert to defensive in an instant. Her hand tightened on the laptop bag, knuckles whitening with pressure. "We need to go," she said, the casual pretense of agricultural sales. Representative completely abandoned. "Now!" Ray hesitated, watching the approaching vehicle with growing concern. Sheriff Tom Miller was an old friend, someone he'd known since high school. There was no logical reason for Elise's reaction unless— "What's in the bag?" Ray asked quietly. Making no move toward the plane, Elise's eyes darted from Ray to the approaching sheriff's truck and back again. "Nothing that concerns you. Please, we need to leave immediately. Not until you tell me what's going on." Ray's voice hardened, military authority resurfacing. "Why are you afraid of the local sheriff?" For a moment, Elise seemed to war with herself, calculation and desperation battling in her expression. The sheriff's truck was less than half a mile away now, its distinctive light bar clearly visible. "I'm not who I said I was," she finally admitted, words tumbling out rapidly. "My name is Elise Morgan, but I don't work in agricultural sales. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Agency. That's all I can tell you right now, but I promise I'm not the threat here." Ray stared at her, processing this revelation. The DIA was the military's primary intelligence arm, responsible for collecting and analyzing intelligence to support combat operations. If Elise was telling the truth, it would explain her knowledge of aircraft, her tactical awareness, her secrecy. It would also explain why she'd been so interested in his military background. "And the sheriff," Ray pressed, aware that time was running short. Elise's expression darkened. "Not everyone in law enforcement is on the right side. That's all I can say. Please, Ray. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical." Ray had spent 20 years making split-second decisions, evaluating threats and trusting his instincts. Right now, those instincts were sending mixed signals. Elise, or whatever her real name was, had lied to him repeatedly. But there was an authenticity to her fear that couldn't be manufactured. The sheriff's truck was now less than a quarter-mile away, slowing as it approached the farm buildings. Ray made his decision. "Get in." They boarded the Agcat quickly. Ray helping Elise into the passenger seat before sliding into the pilot's position. The engine roared to life with a turn of the key, propeller spinning into a blur as Ray pushed the throttle forward. Cooper barked frantically from outside the hangar, confused by his master's sudden departure. Ray felt a pang of guilt. He'd never left without securing the dog inside, but there was no time now. He'll be okay, Ray reassured himself as much as Elise. Plenty of food and water in the house. The Ag Cat rolled out of the hangar just as Sheriff Miller's truck pulled up to the farmhouse. Ray could see the sheriff step out, shielding his eyes against the morning sun as he spotted the aircraft moving toward the airstrip. "He's seen us," Elise said tightly. Ray didn't respond, focusing instead on guiding the aircraft to takeoff position. The sheriff was now jogging toward the airstrip, one hand raised in a clear signal to stop, the other moving toward his sidearm. "Ray!" The sheriff's voice carried faintly over the engine noise. "Hold up!" But Ray had already committed, throttle pushed fully forward as the Ag Cat accelerated down the dirt strip. The aircraft gained speed quickly, wheels bumping over the uneven ground until they lifted into the smooth embrace of the air. As they climbed, Ray banked slightly to look back at his property. Sheriff Miller stood on the airstrip, radio in hand, watching their departure with an expression Ray couldn't decipher from this distance. It was the first time in Ray's life that he'd ever fled from law enforcement, and the significance of that action wasn't lost on him. "Where exactly in Maplewood are we headed?" he asked, his voice deliberately neutral as they gained altitude. Elise glanced at him, seeming to measure how much to reveal. "There's a private airfield 5 miles west of town, small, unmarked. My contact will meet us there." Ray nodded, adjusting their course slightly. He knew the area well, a private strip owned by Harold Matthews, a wealthy weekend pilot who rarely used it. Not the kind of place that would draw attention. "You going to tell me what's really going on now?" Ray asked as they leveled off at 3,000 feet, the Nebraska countryside spreading out below them in a patchwork of fields and farmhouses. Elise sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders now that they were airborne. "I'm part of a counterintelligence operation tracking the theft of classified defense technology. What I told you about being with the DIA is true. What's in this laptop is evidence of a significant breach, one that involves people you wouldn't expect, like the local sheriff and others." She glanced out the window, checking the skies with a practiced eye. "I was transporting this data to a secure location when I was compromised. They disabled my car remotely. It's fitted with new electronic systems that made that possible. I had no choice but to try reaching my contact another way." Ray processed this information, comparing it against her behavior since they'd met. It aligned better than her agricultural sales cover story, but something still felt off. "Why did you try to maintain your cover even after I helped you?" he asked. "You must have realized I wasn't a threat." "Protocol," Elise replied without hesitation. "And assessment. I needed to know more about you before I could trust you. When I learned about your special operations background, I had to report it to my handler. Former military pilots with your qualifications aren't common in rural Nebraska." Ray glanced at her sharply. "You were vetting me? For what?" Before Elise could answer, a new sound cut through the steady drone of the Ag Cat's engine, a high-pitched, electronic tone from somewhere inside the cockpit. "What is that?" Elise asked, suddenly alert again. Ray's expression darkened as he recognized the sound. "Military band radio scanner. I keep it installed out of habit, though it's rarely picked up anything since I moved back to civilian life." He reached for a small receiver tucked beneath the instrument panel, adjusting its frequency. "Someone's broadcasting on secure military channels." The static cleared, replaced by a crisp, authoritative voice. "Unidentified aircraft heading eastbound from Cedar County. This is U.S. Air Force Command. You are entering restricted airspace. Acknowledge immediately on this frequency." Ray and Elise exchanged alarmed glances. There was no restricted airspace in this part of Nebraska, none that Ray knew of, and he kept meticulously updated on all flight regulations. "They're already tracking us," Elise said, voice tight with renewed tension. "They must have established a temporary no-fly zone after I was compromised." "How would they even know we're in the air?" Ray demanded, his hands automatically checking instruments, calculating options. "I didn't file a flight plan for this morning." "The sheriff," Elise said grimly. "He must have reported our takeoff immediately." The radio crackled again, the voice More insistent, crop duster aircraft tail number N5744C. This is your final warning. Acknowledge this transmission and alter your course immediately. Failure to comply will result in intercept. Ray's blood ran cold at the mention of his aircraft's tail number. This was no general warning. They were being specifically targeted. Intercept, he repeated, the implications sinking in. They've scrambled jets for a crop duster? For what I'm carrying, Elise corrected, clutching the laptop bag tighter. The evidence in here implicates people at the highest levels. They can't afford to let it reach my contact. Ray's mind raced, evaluating their limited options. The AgCat was a sturdy aircraft, but it was no match for military jets in speed or maneuverability. Their only advantage was their low altitude and Ray's intimate knowledge of the local terrain. There's a valley about 10 miles ahead, he said, already adjusting their course. If we drop down and follow it, we might be able to avoid radar detection long enough to reach Maplewood. Elise nodded, her face set in grim determination. Do it! Ray pushed the yoke forward, sending the AgCat into a controlled descent. They dropped through 2,000 feet, heading for the tree line that marked the beginning of the river valley. Brace yourself, Ray warned. This is going to get bumpy. The aircraft leveled out just above the treetops, low enough that they could see individual branches swaying in their wake. Ray guided them into the natural corridor formed by the valley, where the rising terrain on either side would help shield them from radar. For several tense minutes, they flew in silence, the only sounds the roar of the engine and the rush of air past the cockpit. Ray flew entirely by visual reference now, following the winding path of the river below, making constant small adjustments to maintain their concealment within the valley's contours. "Think we're clear?" Elise finally asked, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Ray was about to respond when a shadow passed overhead, followed immediately by the earth-shaking roar of jet engines at full military power. Both occupants of the small plane instinctively ducked as an F-16 Fighting Falcon screamed past them, so close they could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. "I'd say that's a no," Ray answered grimly. The fighter jet banked hard, climbing, away before turning back toward them. Through the radio came the voice they had been dreading. "Crop duster N5744C, this is Sierra Alpha 36 of the United States Air Force. You are ordered to reverse course and return to your point of origin. This is not a request. Acknowledge immediately." The F-16 reappeared, taking up positions slightly above and behind the AgCat, close enough that Ray could feel the turbulence from its engines buffeting his much smaller aircraft. "What now?" Elise asked, her professional composure slipping for the first time since Ray had met her. Ray stared straight ahead, his jaw set in determination. "Now we find out just how good that Air Force pilot really is. Because one thing was certain, after what he'd just learned, returning to his farm where Sheriff Miller waited was not an option. Whatever Elise was involved in, whatever was stored, in that laptop she guarded so carefully it was serious enough to bring military aircraft into domestic airspace, and Ray had just become a part of it. "Hang on," he said, gripping the controls tightly. "Things are about to get interesting." What Ray couldn't know was how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how the next few hours would force him to resurrect skills he'd thought he'd left behind forever in the deserts and mountains of distant war zones. The F-16's voice crackled through the radio with unmistakable authority as the fighter jet maintained position behind Ray's AgCat. The massive difference in capabilities between the two aircraft couldn't have been more stark. Ray's crop duster lumbering along at barely 140 knots, while the F-16 struggled to fly slowly enough to stay with them, its powerful engine designed for speeds 10 times what the AgCat could achieve. Ray's hands remained steady on the controls, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 20 years in the Air Force had taught him to think clearly under pressure, to evaluate options methodically, even when time was measured in seconds rather than minutes. "They won't shoot us down," Ray said, loud enough for Elise to hear over the engine noise. "Not over American soil, and not without exhausting every other option first." "You're sure about that?" Elise's voice betrayed her skepticism, reasonably. Ray's eyes scanned the terrain ahead, looking for opportunities. "But they have other ways to force us down." As if to illustrate his point, the F-16 edged closer, the turbulence from its engines creating increasingly violent buffeting that rocked the smaller aircraft. It was a standard intimidation tactic, making flight uncomfortable enough that the pilot would choose to land voluntarily. "What's the plan?" Elise asked, bracing herself against the dashboard as another wave of turbulence hit them. Ray didn't immediately answer. The reality was, their options were severely limited. The AgCat couldn't outrun or outmaneuver an F-16. Their only real advantage was the crop duster's ability to fly extremely low and slow, conditions where the fighter jet would struggle to follow without risking its own safety. "We need to make a decision," Ray finally said, his voice tight with concentration. "I can try to evade them using terrain masking, but the chances of success are minimal, or I can respond to their hails, try to buy us some time." "Time for what?" Elise's eyes were fixed on the fighter jet through the side window, "to figure out who we can actually trust." Ray glanced at her. "You said you have a contact waiting, someone who can verify the information you're carrying. How certain are you that they haven't been compromised as well?" The question hung between them as another burst of turbulence shook the aircraft. Elise's expression revealed the weight of the decision facing her: trust Ray enough to reveal more details, or maintain operational security despite their increasingly desperate situation. "Colonel James Reeves," she finally said. "My contact is Colonel James Reeves, Air Force Intelligence. He's stationed at Offutt Air Base, but is meeting me privately because we don't know how far the compromise extends." The name hit Ray like a physical blow. "James Reeves? Jim Reeves?" Elise's eyes widened. "You know him?" "We served together in the 8th Special Operations Squadron. He was my commanding officer for 3 years. Ray's mind raced with the implications. "If Jim's involved, this is bigger than I thought." Before Elise could respond, the radio crackled again. "Crop Duster N5744C, this is Sierra Alpha 3-6. Be advised, you have 60 seconds to acknowledge and comply before we are authorized to employ disabling measures." Ray knew what that meant. They would use their jet wash to destabilize the AgCat, potentially forcing it into an unrecoverable position. It was time to make a choice. "I'm answering them," he decided, reaching for the radio. "Sierra Alpha 3-6, this is Crop Duster N57444C. Ray Harmon, pilot in command. I acknowledge your instruction." He paused, then added, "Request direct communication with Colonel James Reeves at Offutt Air Force Base. Authentication code Sierra Tango 7-39 Whiskey." There was a long pause, during which Ray could feel Elise's questioning gaze. The authentication code was decades old, something from his special operations days that Jim would recognize if he heard it. A request for secure, direct communication that bypassed standard channels. Finally, the radio came to life again. N5744C, stand by for new instructions. The F-16 maintained its position, but the aggressive maneuvering ceased. Ray and Elise exchanged a glance that contained equal parts. "Hope and apprehension. Sierra Tango 7-39 Whiskey," Elise asked. "Old squadron call sign, and the last 4 of Jim's service number from when we served together," Ray explained. "If this reaches him, he'll know it's me and that I'm requesting secure comms." "And if it doesn't reach him?" Ray's expression hardened. "Then we're in exactly the same position we were in before, except they know I'm former military." Minutes passed with excruciating slowness, the AgCat continuing its eastward path with the F-16 shadowing its every move. Ray maintained their course and altitude, knowing that any deviation might be interpreted as non-compliance. Finally, the radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different, deeper, with the slightest hint of a southern accent that 20 years hadn't completely erased. Sierra Tango, 739 Whiskey acknowledged. "This is Revenant." Ray's breath caught in his throat. "Revenant," Jim's old call sign. "Revenant, this is Dusty, requesting verification and guidance." Dusty described the incident at Omar's Palace, Baghdad, 2003. A security question. Ray smiled, grimly at the memory. "You lost 20,000 Iraqi dinars in a poker game and had to barter with your boots to get back to base." A chuckle came through the radio. "Verified. Dusty, we have a situation that requires immediate resolution. You are carrying a package of extreme importance." "Affirmative," Ray responded, glancing at Elise, who was listening intently. "Package is intact, but we have concerns about delivery location security." "Understood. New coordinates incoming for secure drop point. Local authorities have been compromised. Repeat, local authorities compromised. Trust no one outside this channel." Ray's navigation system beeped as new coordinates were transmitted. He checked them quickly. A location about 30 miles southeast of their current position, in an area of national forest land far from any towns or major roads. "Coordinates received and acknowledged," Ray confirmed. "Will require escort for safety assurance." "Affirmative. Sierra Alpha 36 will maintain escort position. Approach heading 165. Descend to 500 feet AGL for final approach. Land in clearing at transmitted coordinates. Ground team will secure package upon arrival." "Copy all," Ray responded. "ETA approximately 20 minutes at current speed." The radio went silent again. Ray adjusted their course to match the new heading, the Agcat banking gently toward the southeast. The F-16 maintained its position, but its presence now felt more protective than threatening. "You trust this?" Elise asked quietly. Ray considered the question carefully. "Jim Reeves is one of the few people in this world I would trust with my life. If he's running this operation, it's legitimate." "And the authentication questions? Could someone have forced that information from him?" "The poker story isn't documented anywhere," Ray said. "It's personal knowledge, shared between squad members. And he used my old call sign, Dusty, which wouldn't be in any current military records." Elise nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her expression. "I was supposed to make contact at a specific location. This changes the protocol. From what I'm gathering, your original protocol was compromised." Ray kept his eyes on the instruments as they descended to the instructed altitude. "Whatever's in that laptop has people worried enough to scramble fighter jets and establish restricted airspace over Nebraska farmland. This isn't exactly standard procedure for handling intelligence." Elise's hand unconsciously tightened on the laptop bag. "It's evidence of a breach in our weapons development program. Schematics and access codes for next-generation drone systems were being sold to foreign entities. I tracked the breach to a senior defense contractor, but when I reported it, things got complicated." "Complicated how?" "People who should have been concerned seemed indifferent. Investigations stalled. Then my security clearance was questioned." Her expression hardened. "When they tried to transfer me suddenly to a posting in Alaska, I knew something was wrong. I contacted Colonel Reeves directly outside normal channels." Ray nodded, understanding dawning. "And he told you to gather what evidence you could and get out." "Yes, but I never expected the response to be this aggressive." She gestured toward the F-16 flying alongside them. "They're treating this like a national security emergency." "Because it is," Ray said simply. "Next-gen drone tech in the wrong hands could shift the global balance of power. If someone high up in the defense establishment is involved in selling it, that's treason at the highest level." The implication hung heavily in the cockpit. Ray had spent his career defending American interests abroad, often at great personal risk. The idea that someone within the system was betraying those same interests struck at the core of everything he believed in. As they descended toward the coordinates, the landscape below transformed from agricultural fields to the denser tree cover of the national forest. A clearing became visible ahead, large enough for the AgCat to land, but well concealed from main roads or casual observation. "I see the landing zone," Ray reported, both to Elise and into the radio. "Beginning approach now." "Confirmed," came Jim's voice. "Ground team is in position. Sierra Alpha 3-6 will maintain air cover until package is secured." Ray focused entirely on the landing now, his hands moving with practiced precision as he guided the crop duster through its final approach. The clearing was rougher than his farm's airstrip, with patches of uneven ground and scattered small vegetation, but nothing the sturdy AgCat couldn't handle. "What happens after we land?" Elise asked, tension evident in her voice, despite her professional demeanor. "Jim's team secures the laptop and the evidence it contains," Ray answered, his eyes never leaving the approaching clearing. "After that, I imagine there will be debriefings, statements, probably some form of protective custody until they determine the full extent of the breach. And you're involved in this now because of me." Ray allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Let's just say retirement was getting a little too quiet anyway." The AgCat's wheels touched down on the uneven ground, the aircraft bouncing slightly before settling into a bumpy roll. Ray guided it toward the tree line, where natural cover would help conceal the plane from aerial observation. As they came to a stop, Ray caught sight of movement at the edge of the clearing, camouflaged figures emerging from the tree line, moving, with the disciplined precision that marked them as military personnel. Above, the F-16 made a final pass before climbing steeply away, its mission complete now that the package was safely on the ground. Ray cut the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of constant noise. He turned to Elise, finding her already watching him, her expression a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering concern. "Ready?" he asked. Elise nodded, clutching the laptop bag close. "Ray, whatever happens next, thank you. Not everyone would have done what you did today. Couldn't very well leave you stranded in a storm, could I?" he replied with forced lightness, though they both knew his actions had gone far beyond simple roadside assistance. As they prepared to exit the aircraft, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed the moment he'd spotted Elise on that rain-soaked highway. His quiet retirement, his solitary existence on the Nebraska farm, all of it felt suddenly distant, as if belonging to another life entirely. What he couldn't know was how right that feeling would prove to be, or that the true test of his character still lay ahead. Because while landing in this clearing had resolved their immediate danger, it had also placed them at the center of a conspiracy that reached far higher than either of them yet realized. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of American defense, someone had already begun calculating how to ensure their silence. The clearing buzzed with controlled activity as Ray and Elise emerged from the AgCat. 6 operatives in tactical gear secured the perimeter, while 2 figures approached the aircraft directly. One, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked dark hair. The other, a younger woman whose alert posture marked her as security detail. Despite her civilian clothes, Ray recognized Jim Reeves immediately, despite the 20 years that had passed since they'd served together. The colonel had aged well, his face weathered but strong, bearing the composed expression of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Major Harmon," Reeves greeted him, extending a hand. "Never thought I'd see you back in the field." Ray clasped his old commander's hand firmly. "Neither did I, sir. Life takes some unexpected turns." Reeves' attention shifted to Elise. "Agent Morgan, good to see you intact." "Colonel." Elise nodded respectfully, her professional demeanor fully restored. Now that they had reached relative safety, "I have the complete data set." She patted the laptop bag still secured to her side. "Let's get that secured immediately." Reeves gestured to the female operative who stepped forward. "This is Agent Daniels. She'll handle the technical transfer." Elise hesitated, her protective instinct toward the evidence still strong. "Sir, given the scope of the compromise—" "I understand your concern," Reeves cut in, his voice lowered. "But we're working with a vetted skeleton crew. Daniels has level 5. Clearance and reports directly to me." After a moment's consideration, Elise nodded and followed Agent Daniels to a mobile command unit partially concealed at the edge of the clearing, a modified SUV equipped with satellite communications and data processing capabilities. As the women departed, Reeves turned back to Ray, his expression becoming more personal now that official business was temporarily handled. "Hell of a situation you stumbled into, Ray. Picking up stranded motorists used to be a lot less complicated." Ray surveyed the clearing, taking in the tactical team, the communications equipment, the second F-16 now circling high above them. "Seems I've been out of the loop for a while. Since when does the Air Force scramble fighters to chase intelligence operatives across Nebraska?" Reeves's expression darkened. "Let's take a walk." They moved away from the center of activity, heading toward a quieter section of the clearing where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. Ray noted how the tactical team maintained their positions, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. "This goes beyond standard intelligence operations," Reeves began once they were alone. "What Agent Morgan uncovered isn't just a breach. It's potentially the most significant penetration of our defense systems in decades." "She mentioned drone technology," Ray prompted. "Not just any drones." Reeves lowered his voice further. "We're talking about the ARCUS program. Autonomous, reconnaissance and combat aerial system. Next-generation swarm technology with adaptive AI, capable of coordinated operations without human oversight." Ray whistled softly. "Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie." "It would be, except we've already deployed early prototypes. The program's been under development for 15 years, completely black budget, known to fewer than 100 people in the entire defense establishment." "And someone selling the technology," Reeves nodded grimly. "Worse, someone embedded backdoor access codes into the operating system. In the wrong hands, those codes could allow external control of deployed units." The implication sank in immediately. Ray had seen enough of military technology to understand the catastrophic potential. "They could turn our own weapons against us." "Exactly. And whoever has that capability wouldn't even need to use it immediately. The mere threat would provide enormous leverage in international negotiations, military positioning, resource disputes, mutually assured destruction for the digital age," Ray observed. "With one critical difference, it would be completely deniable. An ARCUS unit malfunctions and attacks a civilian target. Could be a software glitch. No radiation, no missiles launched from foreign soil, no traditional act of war." Ray processed this information, understanding now why the response had been so dramatic. This wasn't just national security, it was potentially world-altering technology being compromised. "How did Morgan get involved?" he asked. "She's one of our best digital forensic specialists. We brought her in when we noticed anomalies in the system architecture. She tracked the modifications to their source, a senior project manager with all the right clearances and access." Reeves's jaw tightened. But when she reported her findings, things got complicated. The manager had protection, high-level protection. Reeves nodded. Suddenly, her investigation was shut down, classified as a training exercise. Her findings were dismissed as false positives. When she persisted, they began questioning her methods, her loyalty, even her mental stability. Ray's expression hardened. He'd seen similar tactics used against whistleblowers before, the system protecting itself by discrediting those who exposed its flaws. That's when she contacted you directly. She had no choice. I'd worked with her on a previous operation, trusted her judgment. When she shared what she'd found, I knew we had to move it outside normal channels. Reeves checked his watch, then scanned the sky briefly. I had her gather all the evidence she could, then extract using a pre-planned route. Except someone figured it out. They accessed her vehicle's computer systems remotely, disabled it on that stretch of highway where cell coverage is minimal. Standard procedure would have been for her to wait for friendly extraction. Reeves allowed himself a small smile. They didn't count on a retired Air Force major with a crop duster offering an alternative ride. Ray thought back to the moment he'd spotted Elise standing beside her disabled car, arms waving desperately through the rain. A chance encounter that had escalated into a military operation within 24 hours. And the sheriff? Ray asked, recalling the moment that had forced their hasty departure. How does he fit into this? We're still determining the full extent of the network. What we do know is that several law enforcement agencies were alerted to watch for Morgan after her extraction. Some legitimate. They were told she was a security risk who had stolen classified information. Others, like your Sheriff Miller, appear to have direct connections to the people behind the breach. Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The sheriff had been a fixture in the community for over a decade, someone Ray had considered a friend. The idea that he might be involved in something of this magnitude was disturbing on a personal level. Can I go back to my farm after this? The question had been building in Ray's mind since they'd landed. Reeves's hesitation provided the answer before he spoke. Not immediately. Once they know you've made contact with us, you'll be considered compromised as well, until we've secured. All the principal actors in this conspiracy returning to your previous life would put you at significant risk. The full weight of the situation settled on Ray's shoulders. His quiet existence, his farm, his independence, all suspended indefinitely because of one act of kindness during a storm. "Cooper," he said suddenly. "My dog is still at the farm." Reeves nodded with understanding. "We'll send a team to secure your property and retrieve your dog. He'll be well cared for until you can be reunited." Across the clearing, Ray saw Elise and Agent Daniels emerging from the mobile command unit. Elise's posture had changed. The tension that had characterized her since their first meeting partially released, now that the evidence was being properly handled. "What happens next?" Ray asked. "We process and verify the evidence, identify all involved parties, and prepare for coordinated arrests." Reeves straightened, his voice taking on a more official tone as others approached. "In the meantime, both you and Agent Morgan will be moved to a secure location for debriefing and protective custody." Agent Daniels joined them, her expression professionally neutral. "Data transfer complete, sir. Initial verification confirms Agent Morgan's assessment. The breach is extensive, and the source identifiers are consistent with her report." "Excellent." Reeves checked his watch again. "Extraction helicopter arrives in 10 minutes. We'll move to Offutt for preliminary debrief, then transfer to a more secure facility by nightfall." The tactical team began preparing for departure, collapsing equipment and establishing a landing zone for the incoming helicopter. Ray watched them work with the practiced efficiency that characterized military operations, something he had once been part of but had left behind years ago. Elise approached, looking more relaxed than Ray had seen her since their first encounter, though wariness still lingered in her eyes. "Your Colonel Reeves runs a tight operation," she observed, coming to stand beside him. "He always did," Ray replied. "Best commander I ever served under." "He says we'll be in protective custody for a while," Ray nodded, gazing at his agcat sitting at the edge of the clearing. Looks like crop dusting season is over for me. I'm sorry, Elise said quietly. You're caught up in this because you stopped to help me. Ray considered this, then shook his head. I'm caught up in this because someone decided to sell out their country for profit. You were just doing your job. A distant thumping sound grew steadily louder, the approaching helicopter coming to extract them. The tactical team formed a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, weapons at the ready, though not raised. Agent Morgan, Major Harmon, Reeves called, gesturing them toward the landing zone. Time to move out. As they walked together toward the designated area, Ray felt a curious mixture of emotions. Concern for his future, certainly, but also an unexpected sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since retirement. The quiet routine of his farm had been comfortable, but perhaps too comfortable, a way of withdrawing from the world rather than engaging with it. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, a Black Hawk with no visible markings, its rotors cutting through the morning air with rhythmic precision. As it descended toward the clearing, kicking up swirls of dust and vegetation, Ray turned to Elise. For what it's worth, he said, I'd make the same choice again. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since they'd met, her smile reached them fully. Good to know there are still people like you out there, Ray Harmon. The helicopter touched down, its side door sliding open to reveal two more operatives in tactical gear. Reeves motioned for Ray and Elise to board first, following close behind them as the tactical team began their own withdrawal procedures. As Ray ducked into the aircraft, he cast one final glance at his ag cat sitting forlornly at the edge of the clearing. For 25 years, that plane had been his connection to the sky, his livelihood, his freedom. Now it would be secured as evidence in an investigation that reached to the highest levels of national security. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply as it gained altitude and accelerated away from the clearing. Below, the tactical team completed their withdrawal, leaving no trace of their presence. Within an hour, the only evidence of what had transpired would be a yellow crop duster sitting incongruously among the trees. Ray settled into his seat, feeling the familiar vibrations of military aircraft that he hadn't experienced in years. Across from him, Elise was already being briefed by one of the operatives, her professional focus fully restored. Beside him, Reeves checked a secure tablet, his expression grave as he reviewed incoming intelligence. The Nebraska countryside fell. Away beneath them, the patchwork of farms and fields that had been Ray's world for so long, now reduced to an abstract pattern of colors and textures. He didn't know when or if he would return to that simple existence, but he did know that he had made the right choice when presented with a moral crossroads. Sometimes, Ray reflected, the most important decisions aren't the ones we make after careful deliberation, but the instinctive choices we make when confronted with someone in need. His decision to land his plane during that storm had changed everything, but it had also revealed the truth about the world he thought he'd left behind, and as the helicopter carried them toward an uncertain future, Ray Harmon found himself oddly at peace with that revelation. The Black Hawk helicopter cut through the morning sky at maximum speed, its engines drowning out conversation. Ray sat beside Colonel Reeves, watching the landscape blur beneath them as they headed southeast toward Offutt Air Force Base. 20 minutes into the flight, Ray noticed Reeves checking his secure phone repeatedly, his expression growing troubled. "Problem?" Ray asked. Reeves showed him the screen. "Integrity compromised. Divert to secondary." "Another leak," Reeves explained grimly. "We're diverting. To secure Site Delta, Offutt has been compromised." The helicopter banked sharply, heading south toward the Nebraska-Kansas border. They descended toward what appeared to be an abandoned farming complex, a cluster of weathered buildings surrounding a central structure that might once have been a barn. Inside, what had appeared from the air to be a dilapidated barn revealed itself as a modern security checkpoint. The elevator descended at least 6 floors, opening onto a corridor of polished concrete. Reeves led them through a series of security checkpoints until they reached a set of double doors marked Operations. Inside was a command center where General Catherine Hayes and 2 other officials awaited. Hayes explained that the Arcus system breach appeared to extend further than initially assessed, potentially including elements within Offutt's command structure. The conspiracy involved senior military officials and defense contractors who were positioning to sell access codes to foreign powers for personal gain. Suddenly, Daniels announced that multiple vehicles were approaching the perimeter. At least 3 heavy vehicles, no official transponders. Breach team, Carlton stated. They found us faster than anticipated. Ray felt a surge of adrenaline. How would they know about this location? It means the compromise goes even deeper than we realized, Hayes confirmed grimly. The facility's alarm activated, indicating perimeter breach. They've disabled the outer security cameras and entered the surface complex. 8 to 10 hostiles, heavily armed, Daniels reported. A series of muffled explosions from above made their decision clear. Evacuation route, Hayes ordered. Carlton, take Agent Morgan and the evidence through the escape tunnel. The rest of us will create a diversion. Ray found himself automatically checking the weapon Daniels handed him, a standard-issue Beretta M9. The attackers moved with the coordinated precision of well-trained operatives. Ray fell back on years of training, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Package secured in transport, Carlton's voice finally announced over the radio. Moving to Extraction Point Alpha. The team implemented a fighting retreat, using preset charges to seal the corridor behind them. The escape tunnel led to a concealed garage containing 2 rugged-looking SUVs. They sped toward a small airfield 20 miles south, where a military transport plane waited. As they approached, Ray spotted 2 black SUVs blocking the access road, armed figures taking cover behind them. Reeves took an alternative route, circling around to approach from an unexpected angle. On the tarmac, Elise and her escorts rushed toward the waiting aircraft while hostile forces opened fire. Reeves and Ray provided covering fire, creating a distraction that allowed the package to reach the plane. They watched as the aircraft carrying Elise and the evidence taxied for takeoff and lifted into the clear blue sky. A Black Hawk appeared over the tree line, descending rapidly toward their position while door gunners provided suppressive fire. As the helicopter lifted off with Ray and the team safely aboard, Ray caught a final glimpse of his life as a simple crop duster pilot disappearing below him. Ray stood at the edge of his newly replanted field, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky. Cooper sat beside him, ears perking up as a government-issue SUV approached. Elise stepped out, coming to stand beside him. The final indictments were handed down this morning, she said. 17 individuals in total, including 3 generals, 2 defense contractors, and your former sheriff. Jim mentioned the charges were extensive. Ray nodded. Treason, conspiracy, espionage, the works. The evidence was overwhelming once we got it to the right people. Ray thought about the past 3 months, the debriefings, the protective custody, the gradual process of rebuilding his life while the investigation played out at the highest levels of government. How's retirement treating you? Elise asked, nodding toward the new AgCat in his hangar. Not exactly retirement anymore. The Air Force seems to think I might be useful for occasional consulting work. I might have mentioned your capabilities to certain people, Elise admitted with a small smile. Talent shouldn't go to waste, especially when it comes with such solid judgment. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Ray glanced up at the star-filled sky. For 25 years, he had flown above these fields, finding peace in the simplicity of his chosen life. Now that life had new dimensions, new purpose, new meaning, all because he had seen someone in need and decided to help. In today's world, it's easy to look away from others' problems, but Ray Harmon's story reminds us that sometimes the most important choice we make is to get involved when it would be easier not to. He didn't know that landing his crop duster to help a stranded motorist would lead to fighter jets and conspiracies. He just knew someone needed help, and he could provide it. The truth is, acts of kindness and courage rarely come with warning labels. We simply choose in each moment to be the kind of person who helps or the kind who looks away. So the next time you see someone in need, remember Ray Harmon and his crop duster. Remember that small acts of kindness can lead to extraordinary journeys. And remember that the world changes not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people making the right choice when it would be easier not to. Because sometimes landing your plane in a storm is exactly where your true journey begins.